Good morning. I want to preach to you from Psalm 15. But to do that, we have to agree on which sermon we're going to preach. And I say we because this really is a you and me thing we do together. Preaching isn't nearly as much of a monologue as you might think it is. There's a bit of a dance to it. And we both have to agree on what we're doing here, otherwise we're both going to have a bad time. We have a lot of options. Currently, the Day 4 small group that meets virtually on Wednesday evenings is studying the Psalms with me through a lens of history. And rather than picking one way of reading each Psalm, we are looking at one Psalm through many different lenses across 2 millennia, which means that every Psalm we look at ends up producing a multitude of points, illustrations, and sermons. To think about this a little differently, what we're doing on Wednesday nights, which you're all more than welcome to attend and do with us, is we take pretty much a wide range of all sorts of things that have been written about Psalm 15 by various people throughout the years, and we see how everybody has thought about it in their time and in their place, and see what speaks to us in this time and in this place. And I think it's going to be a lot of fun for all of us. But that also means that we have to pick one for this sermon. Otherwise, we both don't know what dance we're doing. This isn't going to work out. So we need to figure this out. The one thing that was obvious about Psalm 15 is that you have a lot of options on how to read this text. And I want to make sure we all think the same way before we get too far into this. I want us to focus all of our attention on the opening question of the Psalm. Who may abide in your tent? Several different ways we can parse this out and how to think about the tent. The word here for tent is the same word for tabernacle. It's also the same word that John uses to talk about the word becoming flesh and dwelling among us. This is that tabernacling word. And everything that follows in Psalm 15 is an answer to this question. Who may abide in your tent? The rest of the Psalm answers the question. What follows isn't just an answer, though, that describes the person who dwells on God's holy hill. It's a little bit more than that. The person who abides in the tent of God is the one who speaks truth from the heart, does what is right, does not slander their neighbor or do evil against their friends, does not loan money with interest, which is a whole other sermon series in and of itself for another day, and honors those who love the Lord. Each of these is their own little sermon, isn't it? And so we've got to make sure we're on the same page. Technically speaking, what we have here, and I know you all want to do grammar this early in the morning, what we have here is a result clause that gets spread out through the entire Psalm. It's the sentence that explodes itself into other sentences. So we'll do this a bit fast so you don't get bogged down in the grammar, unless it's where you like to live, in which case I'm sorry, we're going too fast. A result clause should show the result of an action. It should explain why something has happened. If it helps, think of this as a grammatical cause and effect. Something has caused an effect to happen. One action in this psalm has led to another thing. Now, I have a theory about this psalm, but to test it, I need all of you to help me test my theory. If this works, everything that I plan to say to you today is going to pan out. But if you all leave me hanging, then we're all doomed to an even more awkward sermon that won't be able to touch the ground. I'm not going to be able to land the plane unless you help me. So help me out. We're going to have a bit of a mental exercise, a warm-up, for your brains to get you going. I know that you're not used to talking during a sermon, other than the texting you do that you think nobody else can see. And so I'm going to start by saying a phrase, and you're going to finish the phrase. You have 2 options on how this can happen. You might think this is silly, and it is, but I need to know that we're all on the same page before we keep going. So here's how it's going to work. 2 options. First, option number 1, I can say the first half of a common, well-known phrase, and you can all, in a very monotone voice, void of all emotion, robotically provide the same answer in unison. That's what you're used to. Your second option relies on the extroverts in the room. I can say the first half of a well-known common phrase, and a handful of extroverts, or all of you technically, if you so wish, but I know the audience, can take one for the team and shout out the answer with a bit more than average gusto. I don't care how we get there, but you need to help me out. And it's got to be more than one of you. I need at least 2 of you on the same page as me so I can go home and sleep. So here we go. Let's start easy. A bird in the hand, 2 in the bush. Monotone robotic voices it is. Got it. Let's keep going. Birds of a feather. Yeah. A journey of 1,000 miles begins Doing good. Almost only counts in horseshoes, and let's turn up the difficulty level just a little bit, and we'll see why this is important. Often with these kinds of proverbial phrases, you find out that they aren't always read the same way or completed the same way. Here we go. Let's turn this up to 11. We have a Wayne's World fan in here. Let's turn this up to 11. It takes two. No, it takes two to make a thing go right. You all failed. I needed one of you to be on the same page as me. It takes two to make a thing go right. Who are you going to call? Better. My name is Inigo Montoya. I've got at least 7. This is going a lot better than I thought it was going to. Finally, the one I've been trying to get us to, the one that matters for the rest of all of this. As long as you live under my roof, follow my rules. As long as you live under my roof, you'll live by my rules. Thanks for playing the game. I needed to know how many of you know this phrase and its operating conditions, because I need to know for how many of you this phrase is likely making you read this psalm in a certain particular way. Both the phrase about roof and rules and Psalm 15 are result clauses, showing you the action that follows as a result of another action. But they don't necessarily say the same thing. They can, but they don't have to. When you hear, as long as you live under my roof, you'll live by my rules, I think you likely hear a conditional clause, an if then. If you want to live here, then you need to follow the rules. One follows the other, or more precisely, one demands that the other follows. You can see this more clearly with the unspoken elaboration of the rest of the phrase, the part we never say out loud, but we always know. As long as you live under my roof, you'll live by my rules. And if you don't, and if you don't live under the roof. I mean, you can fill that blank in however you want to, but there's the door. That's one way of doing this. That's how this sentence plays out. There's a cause and effect here, conditionally. As long as you live under my roof, you'll live by my rules. And if you don't, then you don't stay under the roof. Nod your heads if that's how all of you understand this phrase to work. Okay, I'll work with what I got. I'd also be willing to venture the guess that when you read or hear Psalm 15, that phrase is the lens through which you interpret the psalm. I doubt many of you are reading Psalm 15 any differently than you read that phrase. Who may abide in the tent? The one who follows the rules. And then the rest of the psalm tells you the rules. You wouldn't be the first to read it this way, and you won't be the last. Those who've come before you read Psalm 15 like this, and they came to the conclusion that the only one who could ever be capable of living under the roof would be someone who is perfect. It's Jesus. So when they read or read this psalm, they see Jesus all throughout the whole thing. It's describing Jesus. All these things are very Jesus-y. Who speaks truthfully from the heart? That's a Jesus-y thing to do. Who's kind to their friends? That's a Jesus-y thing to do. It's Jesus all the way through the list. Jesus lives under the roof. Got it. But that tent thing is also Jesus. That's about him tabernacling. John tells us Jesus is the tent, and we know from Hebrews that it's okay to think of Jesus as the place and center of worship. It's not just the temple anymore. He is our new temple. Jesus is, not only is he living under the roof, but Jesus somehow is the roof. And this whole thing is it's Jesus from top to bottom. The tent is Jesus. Jesus is the description. It's all Jesus. And honestly, it has to be if you want to leave here without any guilt or remorse about not being good enough to live in the tent. Otherwise, the odds are great that many of us, well, all of us, aren't worthy to live under the roof or abide in the tent. At one point or another, each and every one of us has done one of these things not quite right. So if the rule is, if you want to live under the roof, you live by the rules, we don't belong under the roof. So you have to say this is about Jesus. Otherwise, you have no hope. That's a very fine puritanical sermon. It's great. It's been done 1,000 times over, but I'd rather not preach that one and give you another option. Rather than reading this psalm conditionally, let's try reading it sequentially. And this is the part where I confess I know I am making a mountain out of a molehill of how to interpret this grammar, but I think it makes the world of a difference. To read this sequentially, it's still a result clause either way. But pun intended, you get very different results if you read this sequentially, not conditionally. In a conditional sentence, the second part of the sentence actually has to come first. We don't say it that way, but that's the way it works. If you want to get paid, then you have to go to work. You have to do the second part before you do the first part. The work comes before the pay. You don't arrange the sentence that way. It's not sequential. It doesn't go in order, but it is conditional. You have to do the second part in order for the first part to happen. It's all backwards. But a sequential result clause puts everything in chronological order. If you touch a hot stove, then you get burned. You don't get burned and then touch the hot stove. You don't do the second part first. You have to do this one in order. They're both result clauses. They're both cause and effect, but you read them in entirely different orders. And I know that you likely didn't want to put this level of distinction here this morning in the grammar, but just 5 more minutes, and then I think I can make this worth something. First things first, and second things second. That's sequential order result clauses. And that changes everything with something like Psalm 15. Rather than demanding that you follow the rules to stay in the roof, which, by the way, Paul argues persuasively about this in his letters, presenting that whole dynamic as unachievable, as a burden. If the law is something that you have to keep in order to be in good graces with God, then we're all doomed. That's the bit that Paul always makes a big deal about. Presenting the rules that way is an unachievable burden. So you have another option. You can read this like Paul would, and you can read Psalm 15 sequentially. Abide in God's house and learn to live God's way. First things first, second things second. Spend time on God's holy hill, and it will change your life. Dwell with God, and as a result, you will be changed. Please, please, please notice the order and which one causes the other. You have to know your cause and you have to know your effect. Rather than gatekeeping this hill by demanding perfect behavior first, treating the behavior like a cause, this psalm is inviting us to encounter God and let that be the cause that affects how we live. It's how God's always done things. If we're being honest, that's how God's always done it from the very beginning. Abraham, he was called out of his homeland, where he likely knew many other gods, but when he was called by God, he wasn't expected to know everything already. God did not sit him down and say, Abraham, I have a business opportunity for you. I'd like to move you to someplace else and give you some land. But before I can deed that land to you, I need to know that you're good with all of these other things and that you behave a certain way and check off my checklist. That meeting doesn't happen. God calls Abraham, Abraham goes, and along the way, Abraham makes mistakes and figures things out the hard way, and God works with him to keep him on course. Abraham learns what it means to be a child of God after he's called to be with God. Cause and effect, sequential. It's got to be sequential. There was no entry test, no expectation for perfect behavior. It's the same thing with Israel after their stint in Egypt. Then 400 years in Egypt, where they forgot a lot of things about God and learned a lot about Egyptian gods. So when God calls them to leave Egypt, God does not sit them down at the edge of the Red Sea and say, I'm going to part this for you, but first, I want to make sure that all of you are good in your behavior. Do you all know the 10 Commandments before you cross the Red Sea? That's not the order of operations in the story. God calls them to leave Egypt. God gives them some rules to follow, not as a way of earning the right to be with God, but as a way of teaching them what life with God looks like. By the time God gave the Israelites the Ten Commandments, they had already been living in the presence of God. One does not earn the other. The rules are not some sort of test of worthiness. They are a result of exposure to the divine. Just like Moses' face shining as he comes down from the mountain is a result, the Ten Commandments are the result of living with God, not the earning of the right to live with God. This is how God has always worked with people. It's the whole premise behind the concept of grace. Grace is a free gift that you did not earn. There is nothing about the concept of grace that can jive with a phrase like, as long as you live under my roof, you follow my rules. That's not grace. That's an earned salvation, which I know for a fact, the majority of you would say is heretical because Paul does, and you agree with Paul, and you like this thing of grace. So if you like grace, you have to read Psalm 15 sequentially. It's not a thing that I think is up for debate or grabs. It's just the way you got to do it. God's love is not something we earn with our right behavior. We are loved by God, and that changes our behavior. One causes the other, and it only works one directionally. Righteous behavior follows naturally from living with God. It does not earn you the right to be with God. Who can abide in the tent? Whose house do we live in? Whose house we choose to live in shapes how we live. Whose roof you choose to be under shapes how you live under the roof. It's just the way it's always been. We just have to rewire our brain a little bit to get there. If you choose to live in a house, it'll change how you live outside of that house. There's something about this. If we're really digging deep here, and I know we are, there's something about this that you see in that one weird little story about Jesus getting lost when he's 12. He runs off from his parents, and somehow we think teaching this to children is a great idea. Jesus runs away from home, and he goes to the church. He goes to the temple, and when his parents finally find him, he is snarky enough and confident enough to sassily tell them, where else did you think I'd be? Which I don't see that playing out well for anybody except for Jesus. I don't see any 12-year-old ever getting away with that except for Jesus. But there's something in that answer that is so Psalm 15. There's something about who Jesus is that would demand that's the roof he be under. Because where else would he have learned to be who he is except from being under that roof? Where else could he possibly be? With the Pharisees in the marketplace, studying at the feet of capitalism? Where else could he be but in the temple? Because he has chosen already at that young age whose house he's going to live under. And it's not Mary and Joseph. It's God's. What a scary thing to realize that your child is already mature enough to choose that at the age of 12. There's something weird about that whole story that I think is rooted in this Psalm 15 choice about whose house you choose to dwell in. If you choose to dwell in the house of war and violence, well, you know this one. If you live by the sword, you die by the sword, because the house you've chosen to live in changes your life and gives you the result of that house. It's the way it always has to be, the way it's always been. If we choose to live by the rules and under the house and under the roof of fill in the blank, you pick it. Pick any of those vices you've read about and all those lists. It's what you're going to get. And I realize at this point, you've all come to the conclusion that I've told you something you already knew. As somebody who preaches on a regular basis, I'm often overwhelmed by the fact that my job is, at least in large part, telling you something you already know. And this is one of those moments, but I'm trying to call your attention to it a little bit differently. I know that you already know this, but I need you to know this the first time you read Psalm 15 and not the third time. Psalm 15 is not the place where you go to find out what you expect from other believers in the church building. Psalm 15 is where you go to look forward to what we all become as a result of being in the presence of God. Those are two drastically different things. Those lists of things that you do and do not do are not things that you expect people to have figured out before they come into the building. It's things they figure out years and years and years of being in the building. This is what becomes of us. This is what transforms us. This is who we become. It's this ongoing process of becoming holy. Who can abide in the tent of God? Absolutely anyone and everyone. And as a result, we all end up looking like God. That's a far more beautiful image than any sort of guilt-ridden thing that demands you be these things before you know God. Grace changes everything. It flips the whole order on its head. It puts things back the way they're supposed to be. Because now, through a lens of grace, what we once read as a second things first has now reordered things back into their rightful position. First things first, second things second. Come to know God, and your life will look different afterwards. We put so much stock on repentance needing to be something that happens up front that we do it sometimes at the risk of ignoring the transformation that still happens after the waters. Repent, yes. Repentance is what gets you into the house. Transformation is what happens after you've been there for years. There's a whole other part of the story that happens after those first 5 steps. That's why you have 2 hands. You can fit all 5 steps in one hand, but there's a whole other hand of things that happen next. Psalm 15 is about what happens next. We all start to look like this. Doesn't mean we have to today, but it does mean we work for it together. It's also why, when you come to this table, you remember 2 different things, one past, one future. You look backwards at this table to the time that Jesus broke bread with the Last Supper with his disciples in the upper room, and you look forward to the time when Jesus takes this meal again with all of us in heaven. It's both and. It has to be both, but you do them in order. We find ourselves in that order, working towards a day when we can take this meal with Jesus in heaven, and looking back at all the meals we've taken with people who are already there. Somehow this wraps all of that thing up in order, but that order always has to be arranged by grace, not by works. And if you didn't think this is important at all, then think about the book of James. When James says faith without works is dead, that is not a conditional clause. That is not a second things first. That is not saying that you have to have works in order to have faith. It means that faith always leads to works. It just naturally does. Changes the order of things. It puts them in their rightful place sequentially. You hear one thing from Psalm 15, the one sermon I want you to hear is to read things in the ordering of grace, not in the ordering of earning or worthiness or works. At this point, you could have just sat through and listened to a Martin Luther sermon from 500 years ago. But I hope this is somehow more accessible. But if you find Martin Luther more accessible, you'll be pleased to know we read from him on Wednesday nights. You have your options. Pick whichever one you want to, as long as you get to the same point. When you come to live underneath God's tent, underneath that roof, you learn to live life the way that God lives life. Not because you have to be there, but because what else would you be there to do? Seems so obvious. I hope it is. If that's a transition that you need to make, if you need to make a move, I'm pleased to announce that this housing market is easier than the housing market around us. It is much easier to move into God's tent than it is to move into a home in this neighborhood. It is far cheaper, it is far more accessible, and anybody can do it. It doesn't matter your financial status or your credit score or anything, you get to do it. That spiritual housing change is very simple, and it's very welcoming and a very good thing to do, and it seems so obvious to do. And if that's something you need to hear more about, the elders are available at the back as we sing the next song, and I'd love to talk to you about that. And if you'd like to complain about the sermon, I guess they'll hear that too, but they're not going to enjoy it nearly as much. But these are your options. Unfortunately for you, the phase where audience participation encourages you to shout out right now what you're thinking at me has ended. So I'm not encouraging that, but you can at least go to the elders in the back and vent there, or share your good news or your burdens or your sufferings. And we all live underneath that same tent. So what affects one of us affects all of us. And we'd like to do that with you. Let's stand and sing.